After mentioning in a previous blog that many of my students would be in tears when I used to teach them about ancient Roman crucifixion, what Jesus had to endure on the cross, somebody asked what it was like. Well, while I don't have the time to go into all the details, I can highlight 3 things that will give you a pretty good sense of how awful it was. Fair warning though, even though this is just a description, some of the details are really graphic. Ancient crucifixion, the Romans, they have many methods that they could use to put somebody to death by crucifixion. But in Jesus' case, they needed to choose the most expedient and therefore intensely painful one, because they needed him dead by sundown that Friday. The next day, the Saturday, was a Sabbath, a holy day, and they couldn't leave exposed corpses on the crosses without offending the Jews, which then likely would cause riots, which the Romans desperately wanted to avoid. So in cases like this where they wanted to hasten death, they would scourge the person first. Scourging is whipping them. And while the Romans had 3 different levels of scourging, the one they used before crucifixion to hasten death was the most extreme level. They would take the person to be crucified, they would tie their hands together like this up against some kind of pole or post, have them bent over slightly, and then strip them naked. Then the Roman soldier who was in charge of administering the scourging would stand on one side of them, right beside them, and he'd use something called a flagellum, which was basically a handle, a stick that had 3 leather straps attached to it. At the end of those straps was a little piece of metal. It usually had 2 balls on either end, so it looked like a little barbell. Sometimes they would use the jagged bone from animals, and sometimes they used both. They'd have those little barbell metal things at the tip, and then along the strap they would attach some of the animal bone. He would take that instrument and, using a wide arcing motion, he would violently whip it so that it wrapped around the other side of the person's body, the person that was about to be crucified, around their body. Sometimes it would even go all the way around to the front side, like to the chest. And then once the metal or the bone had penetrated, had sunk into the skin, he would rip straight across so that it would tear off all the skin and bring out chunks of flesh with it. He would do that about 80 to 120 times, going from the top of the shoulders along the back all the way down to the calves. When the scourging was over, the person's back was completely shredded. It looked like ribbons of flesh. There were massive amounts of flesh and even bone exposed. Scourging could easily kill you. The shock, the trauma, the blood loss of it could easily kill you. It was that bad. But these Roman soldiers were expert at bringing people to the brink of death without actually killing them. If they did, they could be put to death themselves, because for the Romans, the most important thing about crucifixion was the public spectacle of it all. They wanted the person alive so that they could be hung up on that cross to warn people that if you mess with us, if you mess with Roman authority, this is what we're going to do to you. When the person had been scourged, then they took them and they gave them this the crossbeam. They didn't have them carry the whole cross. They gave them just the crossbeam, the horizontal beam, which is this big piece of wood, unfinished, very rough cut, splintered often wood, and put it over their back. So right on top of the back of the shoulder, that's all now exposed with flesh and even some bone. They had to carry this big wooden beam. They tied their arms up and back and over the beam so that as they walked from where they were scourged to where they were about to be crucified, which usually wasn't that long. In Jesus' case, it was about a quarter mile from the praetorium where he was scourged to Golgotha, where he was crucified. The Romans knew that the person would likely, being delirious from the scourging, fall several times, stumble and fall. And when they did, being tied in this manner, they had nothing to break their fall. They would do basically a face plant into the ground, the dusty, dirty, hard-packed ground that was often filled with rocks. It was rocky, and worst of all, it was dung infested. The animals that walked over it would routinely go to the bathroom, and eventually all that dung would be hard-packed. So those falls would just add to the humiliation and cruelty of crucifixion. The Shroud of Turin, it's hotly debated whether it's actually the burial cloth of Jesus, but whether or not it is, it accurately shows evidence of those kinds of wounds consistent with that kind of fall. There's bruising around the knee and in the nose and cheekbones, high cheekbones of the shroud that would be consistent with somebody falling but not being able to break their fall. And they got the person to the site where they were going to crucify them. They would throw them on their back, their completely exposed back, and then nail their wrists to the crossbeam. They would put the nail about a little bit bigger than this, 5 to 7 inches, a nail somewhat like this. They would put it in the wrist between the palm of the hand and the end of the wrist. I know most crucifixes show it through the hand, but that's inaccurate. If it went through the hand, it couldn't support the body weight. It would just rip right through between the bones. It would rip the flesh out. So they put it right here between the palm of the hand and the wrist. And then they would pull the person up against the vertical beam, which is fixed. It was already there. It stayed there all the time. They would pull their exposed back up against this also very rough cut piece of wood, splintered piece of wood, and then fasten them up against the back of it and finally nail their feet to secure them on the cross. What many doctors who studied the forensics of the cross say was one of the worst parts, if not the worst part of crucifixion, was the nailing of the wrist, because when they did that, when the Romans did that, it actually penetrated, crushed the median nerve. That created a condition known as causalgia, which sends these waves of shock-inducing pain all the way up the arm and into kind of the upper torso. As one doctor who's studied the crucifixion, the forensics of the crucifixion, says, the most comparable thing, the thing that makes sense of what that experience was like, is when somebody has a limb blown off. So in studies he's done on soldiers in combat who've had limbs blown off, the pain sensation is similar to that. And as he says, in some of those cases, it's reported that those soldiers who've had limbs blown off, the pain is so bad that they beg their buddies to shoot them, to put them to death. It's no wonder that they had to invent a new word to describe the unique torture that crucifixion was back then. It's in English, the derivative of that word is excruciating. That's where the word excruciating comes from. They needed a word to describe how unique and over the top crucifixion was, because there was nothing else like it, nothing else that compared to the horror and torture of it. In fact, the Romans eventually saw how over the top it was. By the 2nd century, they stopped doing crucifixion, which was only reserved for non-Roman citizens to begin with, because it was backfiring on them. They weren't great humanitarians. It's not like they grew a conscience or grew a heart. They stopped doing it because it was actually instigating resistance. It was inspiring violent rebellion, which crucifixion was designed to do the opposite. You don't have to be a believer to accept that this is what happened to Jesus. These are just the historical facts about ancient crucifixion, the straight up historical facts. But if you do believe in him, it is so much more than the facts. If this description made you cry, good. The reason I used to go through this with my students is because I wanted them to see the exceedingly awesome, stunning love God has for them, that he would go through this, that he would do this for us. Meditating on the vicious, brutal, demonic reality of crucifixion enables us to see the breadth and depth of his love for us. And this wasn't the worst part for Jesus. The physical pain wasn't the worst part. Aside from the humiliation and the rejection and the betrayal, the psychological and emotional trauma that he experienced on top of the physical pain, the worst part for him was the abandonment of God, the infinite separation that he experienced, that he felt from the infinite love of the Trinity. Especially this Holy Week, contemplating what happened on the cross, contemplating the gruesome reality of it, as hard as that is, can enable you to experience deeper and deeper levels of his love for you. He didn't hold anything back. That's how much he loves you. So, what do you think? If you were God, would you suffer and die on a cross to save humanity? Let me know what you think by going to the Raising Jesus website, the Contact EJ page, and leaving your comments there. Also, please like the Raising Jesus Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and tell your friends about us. Thank you, and have a blessed Easter.